So what happens is, we're talking about all of these different aspects of the game design. And, as I can imagine, the temptation is, as a game designer, you want to throw in everything in the kitchen sink because you've spent a lot of time designing, you've been thinking about this, you've been mapping things out, you've been doing, working on the minimum product design documents, your boss is banging on your door. And so you have this temptation to develop this cognitive overload for your in your game. And we talk about that a little bit. And so why is it not good to have cognitive overload? What does that do to the gameplay process?
Well, in principle, it's never good to have cognitive overload, right? I mean, if you're dwelling in the space of cognitive load theory, there's this idea that any given learning task, any given task, involves an individual having to put cognition into practice, right? And so there's something called extraneous cognitive load, which is this idea that things that are designed into learning activities can in fact make it more difficult for the learner to engage in the learning task, right? Now, there's some amount of subjectivity, right, associated with it's very, very hard to point at something and say that's extraneous load, right? That gets challenging. But in principle, it makes sense, right? You don't want to overburden the learner in some learning environment, right? So you don't want to have all these seductive details, for example, right? Sure, you want to get lots of information in there, but it turns out that a learner can't necessarily take all that information in, right? Or depending on the design, there might be pieces of information that are conflicting with one another. So, the job for any learning designer, whether they are a designer of instructional videos, whether they are a designer of instructional games, whether they are a designer of instructional texts, is to do everything they can to ensure that they are limiting extraneous cognitive load in the activity. And the best way to do that is to pilot your materials, right? Is to try and get your materials out in front of the people that you think are, some representative of the people that you think are ultimately going to be using those materials, and see what happens.
Yeah, it's interesting. That reminds me of, I remember listening to a game designer one time talk about that concept in wayfinding, in the sense of trying to make it down a path. And it's always, I do this sometimes, and as they say, if you can squint and figure out where you're supposed to go, that's a good design.
Right.
Because they winnowed down the information that you actually need. So I challenge some of you, when you're playing some of your games, try squinting and see it, and see where it takes you. See if it takes you off track, or if you actually, oh, now I understand, I've reduced the amount of information I need. Yeah, that's great. So we talked a little bit about game mechanics, and I know you have a lot of expertise in the area of assessment, and we're talking about educational games here. So help us understand, how do game mechanics give rise to assessment? How do we get from here to here?
So if you think about a game, there's lots of ways to think about games, but one way that we as educators can think about games is as tools for performance-based assessment, right? So what do I mean by that? So unlike things like standardized exams, which have their place, an authentic assessment, or what's characterized as an authentic assessment, is a problem or problem space or problem environment that gives learners the opportunity to put into practice the desired competencies or skills or dispositions that we're hoping to see from the learner outside of the game, right? Just like when we're learning in school or any formal spaces, well, we're doing learning in that space, but typically we're doing that learning such that it can get applied outside of that formal learning space, right? Well, it's similar with educational games, right? So we want to create games that have mechanics that are aligned with the doing, with the verbs, with the learning verbs that we want to see happen outside of the game, right? And if we can design a game such that players can use those mechanics meaningfully,
Hmm.
so that they are actually playing the game and are able to make progress in the game and are able
Hmm.
to demonstrate either growing mastery or demonstrate where they're too challenged,
Hmm.
and they need different forms of feedback. Um, but by doing that, we've created a space that allows players to build and practice those skills. One, right? So as a type of formative assessment. Um, but if we're able to monitor those behaviors, if we're able to collect data, then we have a kind of assessment, right?
Hmm.
And if we feel good about the relationship between the mechanics, the feedback that learners get when they put the mechanics into practice in the game space,
Hmm.
and then how those align to real world problem scenarios that are going to require the use of those mechanics,
Right.
then we can, in theory, we can feel pretty good about that game as an
Yeah.
assessment. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
It does. And it strikes me that one of the most obvious examples of this is puzzle-based games. So
Mhm.
you're in a room and you have to solve a puzzle of some sort. Now, I know this is kind of an oversimplification, but just staying with this for a second, how do you need to put together a sequence of images, you need to put together information in a certain order, you need to be able to bring disparate elements together in a way to form some kind of construct. And by doing that, that provides the solution that allows you to get to the room, to unlock the puzzle, to meet the person, to get some piece of knowledge that allows you to progress in the game.
Exactly right. Yeah.
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 And we can
Exactly.
measure that, right? We can measure that, right? That did you get it together? How long did it take you to get it together, right? How many tries did it take you to get it together, right? All
Yeah.
of those elements, right?
And there's a spectrum here, right? So puzzles are interesting cases of games, right? In that puzzles typically they're pretty binary, right? There's a right answer and there's a wrong answer, and that can exist for
Mm-hmm.
games too. But sometimes there's some more gray space. And so you can imagine games that are more puzzle-like, right? Did you unlock? Did yes or no? Did you unlock? Did you do this or did you do this? And then continuing on in complexity where it gets fuzzier, right? Where the problems are more complex, where they require combinations of
Mm-hmm.
mechanics, right?
Right.
And the answer might not always be that clear, or there might be multiple solutions
Yep.
to a problem. And a well-designed game, in theory, can be a good space for both of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. There is a wonderful example of a cognitive apprenticeship, and you might be familiar with that notion, but some of our students might not be, where you actually have a student working as an apprentice to someone, and they're getting further along in the cognitive process because they're being assisted. So that's what maybe a faculty member sitting next to a student helping them solve a complex math problem. That's cognitive apprenticeship. There is a great experience, if you ever do this in VR, called the Under Presents, where you go through the experience and there's a part where you come up to this thing, you have to get out of an elevator. And you go to the elevator, you push the button, nothing happens. You disappear, you restart at the beginning of the level again. But then this time you see there's this funny person next to you and they're pushing a button and then they disappear. And then you try a different button and then you disappear. And then you come back and now there's two different people pushing buttons. And if you haven't gotten this, the key here, the mechanic is the game is recording you making all the mistakes. You are being your own cognitive mentor in that moment, and the game is recording you in that moment. That's a mechanic that's being used to teach you something. So we talk. So that's a puzzle to itself, but it's not being like solve this grid of four things. It's showing you how to get through this space by teaching you, by showing you your past mistakes.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a great. I love that. I love that. If any of you have a chance to try that, I'm going to try to get that on some headsets so we can try in the classroom. So now that we've talked a little bit about that, what I like to do is now kind of bring this home, and students in this course are thinking about game development as educational products, right? We've been kind of talking about that. And from your perspective, what do savvy game makers include in their products that allow for meaningful data to be assessed? So there's lots of stuff that we could assess. There's lots of different mechanics that are going on. but once again, we have learning objectives that we're kind of steering all of this for, that we're aiming this. What do the smart game designers know that allow them to get to really good assessment data?
So there's a couple of things, right? So one, it depends on who's doing the assessment. So are we talking about students engaging in self-assessment, which we certainly could be and should be? Then we need to think about, okay, well, what do students need to see? Either in the game space or outside of the game space, to give them some indication of their progress, right? So that assumes a student or player knows the goals, right? So that's one thing.
Right.
Now, right,
Yep.
we need to make the goals and objectives really clear,
Yep.
which games often do, not always, but you know, it can be frustrating to play a game if you don't know how to win, if you don't know
Right.
what the win state is,
Right.
right? It's
Absolutely.
okay. In fact, it can be great to play a game if you don't know the processes for winning, right? Because that's part of playing and getting better at a game. But if you don't know what the actual win or lose state is, well, that's frustrating. So we need to make sure learners are aware of that. We need to make sure that learners have opportunities to see what they did, right? So if they use a mechanic or mechanics to do something in the game space, and if they fail, well, they need to get feedback that provides them. So, right, just this example you're giving, there needs to be something to see or hear or reflect upon later that's going to enable them to make a change if needed, or that's going to enable them to say, okay, I got it because I'm advancing, right?
Right.
So in the Salen and Zimmerman text, right, there is this concept of meaningful play. And that's one of the things about meaningfulness, right, is that there needs to be coherence. You need to be able to make a connection between what you do as a game player and what happens in the game space. And this is true for any learning activity, right? You need to be able to make a connection between what you do and what happens. And if you can't make that connection, then as a designer of learning activities, we failed, frankly.
Right.
So educational game designers, savvy educational game designers, need to make sure that that data is apparent to learner/players, right? Now, if we're talking about educators making assessments, well, there too, the designers and developers need to think about, okay, well, what do educators need to see? So video games, digital video games produce enormous amounts of data. And they can produce enormous amounts of data, right? There's all of this telemetry, all of these streams of data. It's not all meaningful for an educator.
Right.
Right? Certain forms of data could certainly be meaningful for game developers, right? But with respect to the learning objectives, not all data is meaningful. So then it's incumbent upon savvy educational game developers to know what it is that an educator needs to see with respect to the learning objectives, right? So learning objective is being able to make distinctions between different argument schemes, to pick an odd example. Then, you know, you need to think about what does the educator need to see data-wise, right? So you need to explain the mechanics. You need to explain the relationship between the doing and the game. And again, so, okay, if I am trying to get learners to make distinctions between an argument from evidence versus an argument from comparison, so on and so forth, then there are different mechanics in a game. There are things I can do in a game. Sometimes I'm called upon to create an argument from authority. Sometimes I'm called upon to create an argument from comparison. And those have different mechanics associated with them. And so educators need to know that. They need to know the relationship between the mechanic and these different learning goals, right? And data needs to be served up in such a way that it's going to enable educators to make inferences, right? So these are different things. A game can be a learning space, right? A game can be a space in which a player begins playing and we hope they are becoming aware of and building and practicing certain skills. But also the game can be an environment that produces data for others to interpret.
Right.
But for others to interpret that data, we need game developers and designers, one, to be really confident about the relationship between the mechanics in the game and the desired mechanics outside of the game.
Right.
And then how that gets served up so that it's meaningful for learners and educators.
Right.
But it's a long answer. It's not a very
No, it's not.
I don't think it's a very straightforward space.
It's not. And, it also strikes me that and we don't really get, the article doesn't really get into this, but I do think it's important to mention this notion of meta-analysis, where we're talking about right now analyzing gameplay within the space of the beginning, from the time you hit put the quarter in the game. Sorry, students wouldn't know, maybe stand-up games, but from the time you hit go to the game, to the credits roll, that's one set of data. Now let's see what happens when we apply that across another game. And I'm thinking about serialized games that, there's version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4. Resident Evil is really big about this, right? The way I handle my weapons in those games is relatively the same.
That's right.
That mechanic stays the same. The question is, how do I respond to different threats? Right? How do I respond to the different monsters in the game? And then seeing how what sticks from one game to another is a measurable metric, isn't it? And so that way, if you were to measure player performance across multiple games, you could start doing these meta-analyses by looking at all the data aggregated.
That's exactly right. Or even within one game where we have levels, right? So if we're leveling up and you're called upon, and you will be called upon repeatedly to apply a mechanic, but in an increasingly complicated situation, right?
Yes.
Or in an increasingly ambiguous situation, right? Well, we want to see, we know as learning designers that we still want the players to use that mechanic, but we want to see, okay, can they use that mechanic effectively in these increasingly complex problem spaces?
Yep. And that's the boss fight right there, right? I mean, that gets you to the boss level. It's not just the grunts anymore. Now you're fighting the big guy.
Exactly.
And can you apply it to do all the combinations we talked about before?
Yep.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it. That kind of going to conclude our learning mechanics and assessment mechanics for learning our article. And we'll be back for another one. Thanks a lot.